Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Happy Vesak. In case you don't know what that means, Vesak is a Buddhist festival that celebrates the Buddha's everything, his awakening, his birth, his death. And the reality of it is nobody knows, of course, when the Buddha was born or when he died or when he was awakened. In that particular culture, at that particular time and calendars were much less important than they are today. There was no sense of history as there tends to be more in the West. History was actually an invention of the Hebrew people some 2,000 years ago. Began to look at time linearly rather than circularly, which is the way it tended to be seen in the East. Time just was. In fact, there was a word in Sanskrit, I forget exactly what it is, but it means now or not now. Those are the only two times there is. Now and now. So the title of our talk today is, That's a Good Question. So when you hear someone say that, when you ask a question and someone says, that's a really good question, what does that mean to you? If you ask me a question and I said, that's a good question. Usually means you don't have the answer, right? And almost by definition, that's what a good question is. It's a question that doesn't have an answer. Not because it's something that nobody knows. It's a question that cannot be answered at the same level as the question is given. The answer cannot come in words. You see, it does have an answer, but the answer can only be experienced. It cannot be answered, Classic example of, I were to say to you, what is love? We would all give a different definition, and many of us would say it can't be defined. But it can be experienced, of course, right? So we know it when we experience it, even though there's no particular words, there's no answer to that question, and yet that question can be lived. And so that's the essence of a good question, is that we can't answer it in words, but we can answer it through our life experience. So that's what I want to talk about, is how we go about asking and answering questions. Because in our culture in the West, we're deeply conditioned to have answers. If you're going to run for political office, you better have all the answers, you say. If somebody says, I'm running for president and I have no idea what I'm going to do when I get there, they'd be very honest, right? But they wouldn't get elected. So we have to come up with answers, even though we know it's just a game in many cases, you see. When I was 6 years old, I knew all the answers to the important questions of life. I knew who I was. I knew what God was. I knew why I was here. I knew what it was all about. Not because I was wise. I was not a child prodigy. It was simply because all of the answers were stuffed into my head. I was told who I was and why I was here and what God was and why I existed, etc., etc. I had the answers, even though I wasn't even asking those questions, you see. And that's sometimes the nature of education, is we answer a lot of questions that aren't even asked. In fact, that's why I tell, people say, why aren't more people going to church on Sunday? And I say, because typically religion is answering questions that nobody's asking. And they're not answering the questions that people are asking, you see. And the questions that are being asked are not questions that can be given answers in a book or in words. And I think maybe that's one reason why Buddhism is becoming so popular today, is that it's a different approach to responding to the questions of life. It doesn't give any answers, and yet it gives you the opportunity to find the answer, to discover the answer for yourself. So a good question has no answer other than the answer that we provide out of our own life experience. But the mind is conditioned, the Western mind in particular, to know. I have to know. You know, how to do this, what to do, who am I, why am I here? Yes. Often, many of us identify with being someone that has all the answers. Maybe we consider ourselves an expert in some field. I hope not, but maybe typically we do. And I'm not putting down the idea of expertise, because it is of value. And yet at the same time, if we hold on to answers too much, we're no longer experts. Because today's experts is tomorrow's obsolete practitioner. Yes, that's one reason why I've always loved science. Science is always, at least in theory, not scientists necessary, but science, is open to always finding new questions, new answers. And so the whole idea is, whatever answer I come up with, let's see if we can find a better answer. Let's see if I can prove my old answer wrong and come up with a better answer. And so people that have answers and refuse to let go of those answers can be problematic and even dangerous in our world today. Yes, particularly if they want you to have the same answers that they have, even though you're not asking the same questions they're asking. They want you to have those answers. Yes, and I say that's problematic because it lives a life that's closed and dead. And particularly if it tries to inflict that same viewpoint on other people, it can be a deadening experience, a closing down experience, rather than an opening experience. Sometimes when we say, I don't know, that's really quite a vulnerable feeling, isn't it, sometimes? I don't know the answer to that question, you know. Maybe I'm supposed to know the answer to that question. And that's why in this tradition, the focus is historically not necessarily been on giving answers, but on inquiry. Inquiry is very different than asking questions. Inquiry is living in a state of open curiosity. What is this? Who am I? What is this all about? Who are you? You know? Not from the point of view of, okay, I got the answer, you tell me I got the answer, or, geez, I've come up with that answer. But it's a way of life. We live a way of life. We're taught to have the answers. If we don't have the answers, we don't graduate. We don't pass the test. We don't get good grades. You know, we don't get into the school that we want. And so we spend our life, sometimes the first 24 years of our life, coming up with answers. And again, I'm not putting that down because it does have a place in our world today. And yet, it's got its disadvantages. So let's realize that all knowledge is relative, that all knowledge is impermanent. And I don't have to pretend I don't know what I do know, but I also have to realize that what I do know may not be right. And if it is right, it may be right for now, but maybe not 10 minutes from now, you see. We live in a universe that's constantly changing. So the answers are constantly changing. The questions themselves are constantly changing. In fact, when I work with individuals one-on-one, I usually tell them my job is not to give you answers, but to help you ask the right questions. To ask the questions that are going to open you up to growth, and deeper awareness. So we don't need to, if you're coming here for me to give you the answers, you'll probably be disappointed because I don't have the answers. I don't even have the questions. But I can invite you to bring the question, to bring your question. What is the question that really is burning for you? So much of the time we're taught not to ask silly questions. So many times when somebody raises their hand in a class, they'll say, well, this is a silly question. I'll say, well, that means it's a good one. The sillier, the better. Because a silly question is one that challenges our assumptions. Some of the greatest breakthroughs in science come from very silly questions, or what appear to be very silly questions, you say. An example, why does time run only forward? Why doesn't it run backward? It sounds like something a 6-year-old would ask, right? Well, you know who asked that question? Stephen Hawking. You see, and from that question came his work around, A Brief History of Time was the book that was sort of a condensed version of his study that came out of that. What is time? That's a good question, right? Nobody has the answer. It's a fascinating question. It can take us a lot of different places. So good questions really challenge what we think we already know. So the question I have is, what question are you living? What question is at the heart of your life's experience? If you have the answer and you're trying to give others the answer, I hope that's not the case. If you have lots of questions, let's talk. I want to hang out with you. I used to say, God save me from people that have the answers, particularly if they want to give me the answers, you see. In the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha discouraged certain questions and encouraged others. The questions that he discouraged were the speculative questions, such as what happens to us after we die? How many lifetimes do I have to live before I'm enlightened? Or whatever, those kinds of questions. Is there a God? Where did the universe come from? Those are questions that no one has the answer to, number one. And those are the questions that the Buddha said were just sidetrack. would really take us off the path that we're on. He often talked about if we were shot, if a man were shot by a poison arrow, before he would let his friends remove the arrow from his body, he said, no, wait a minute, I need to know what kind of wood the shaft of the arrow was made from. I need to know what kind of bird the feather on the arrow came from. I need to know what kind of stone the head of the arrow came from. I need to know how tall the archer was, what kind of wood the bow was made from, and on and on and on. This goes on for several minutes. And he says, okay, what would happen to that man? Well, the disciples said, surely he'd be dead before he got his answers. And the Buddha looked at him and said, and you too will be dead before you get all your answers. So we let go of those questions, but the questions we don't let go of are the questions that deepen us rather than distract us. The questions that only you can come up with. The questions like, how do I know what's true? There's a sutra story from the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha he traveled throughout much of northern India during his lifetime. And one of the cities he came to was a place called Kalama. And it evidently was kind of the sort of the New Age center of its time. Northern California, if you will, of India. And the people said, we have gurus, we have teachers, we have wise people coming through here all the time, and you're just one more. Why should we believe you? We've heard 10 others. Now we hear you. Why should we believe you? You know what the Buddha said? Don't believe it. I don't want you to believe anybody but yourself. You say, don't believe anything that's not true for you. So what's real? What's true? What's right? What's here right now? The whole idea of the inquiry is very much a part of the Buddhist tradition. In Rinzai Zen, for example, they're famous for their koans. What is the sound of one hand clapping? That's a question. It sounds like a question, but it's really obviously has no answer, and it sounds like a very silly question. And the answer to that question is not in words, but it's in the response that the person has. What is the sound of one hand clapping? If there's a goose inside a bottle, how do I get him out without killing the goose? There is no goose inside the bottle, right? I just said if there was. Right? Yeah. So it's like we learn to question the assumptions. And we create problems, and then we try to answer them without looking at what questions or what answers are the questions assuming. We've all had the experience of people, maybe not all of us, but I certainly have, of people coming to you and saying, are you saved? It's an interesting question, but you're making an assumption, right? Saved, you're assuming that I'm lost, or that I need to be saved from something. And so much of the time we have these embedded assumptions in our questions. And so when we look at the question itself, it can be very, very helpful to say, what am I assuming in that question? And when I answer a question, what assumptions am I making? What am I taking to be true? Very good question. What am I taking to be true? There's one story from Buddhism, and I'll close shortly after this. There's one practice in Korean Zen in particular. The question is always, what is this? You take your present moment experience and you ask the question, what is this? What is this? What is this breath? You know, what is this sensation? And so, working with an orange, for example, Thich Nhat Hanh has a practice of working. What is this? What is this orange? Is it the color orange? Is it the sphere? Is it the smell? Is it the taste? What makes it an orange, you say? So that kind of thing is very common. What is this experience? So anyway, there was a Korean Zen teacher visiting the Dalai Lama one time. And he challenged the Dalai Lama to a debate. And the Dalai Lama was not much interested in debate, but he wanted to be a good host, so he said, okay, let's do it. Let's do a debate. And so they sat down in front of a small audience. And the debate was not about who's right, who's wrong, but debating is part of the certain tradition, so I can sharpen my knowledge, sharpen my questions. So the Zen monk took out an orange. He showed it to the Buddha. He showed it to everybody. He says, what is this? What is this? What is this really? And the Dalai Lama turned to one of his translators and he said, don't they have oranges where he comes from? So he was not asking the same question the Zen monk was, you see. So looking at the questions that drive our lives are the most important questions. What questions are you living? Einstein says to live with a holy curiosity. To live with a holy curiosity. I love that. Never stop questioning. Never lose a holy curiosity. That was his. That really was his attitude toward life. He wouldn't have discovered what he discovered if he thought he already knew all the answers, you see. So I want to close with this idea of being a learner being one who's always has open questions. Eric Hoffer, the American philosopher, writes, in times of radical change, it is the learners who will inherit the earth, while the learned will be beautifully equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. Okay? So what is this? What questions are you living? What's here right now? Thank you for sitting in the question with us this morning.